13,000 years ago, there were Native people living in this whole interior area. They found remains down at Shaw Creek on the highway here of an Indian family living on that bluff. We come from a wide-ranging people that traveled following the fish and game in the area, primarily the game. So they moved from one hunting area to the next and kept moving around, using and occupying the lands. That's important for us and how Doyon claims its lands.
Well, I'll go back in history. I think it started from 1915 when the Tanna chiefs first met with Judge Wickersham.
Leaders of the interior got together. They called a meeting in Fairbanks to talk about the problems they were having now with the incursion of all the prospectors and the white people coming to town, and they were disrupting the hunting grounds, of course, for Native people. And they wanted to know how they could protect their land and way of life.
Arctic Slope, they formed what was called the Barrow Improvement Association in Kotzebue. They organized because the town site trustee was in BLM was selling the land in Kotzebue to outsiders, and it should have been in trust. So they organized because their land was disappearing. And BLM was not paying any attention to these to the formal protests. In 1966, Bob Bennett, who was area director in Juneau, got selected to be the Bureau of Indian Affairs commissioner. He asked him a question. The United States is spending millions of dollars a year, hundreds of millions of dollars a year on the Indian problem. And for the past 200 years, nothing has changed. High infant mortality rate, short lifespan, poor housing, undereducation, no jobs. They said to him, you are an Indian yourself. He was an Oneida Indian. And what would you do different? And he started to answer the question. The chairman of the committee, Washington Senator Scoop Jackson, stopped him and said, I want a formal report in writing in 90 days. So that report came out in April of 1966. They devoted a small part of it to Alaska. And the thing that caught my attention was that it said the Bureau of Indian Affairs was drawing up a final solution to the land problem in Alaska. And I knew nothing about Congress or law or anything else. And I sat on it for a while wondering what to do. And then finally in July, I wrote a letter to 14 people. Some I knew by name, I mean in persons, mainly from Mount Edgecombe, and a few I knew by reputation. In July, I sent a copy of the letter to Howard Rock and Nick Gray. Both had a dream of having a statewide meeting. The anxiety was in the villages and people were ready to do something because they were being ignored. So instead of 12 people showing up for the meeting in October of 1966, about 300 people showed up. And we had a 3-day meeting. One of the things we did at that first meeting, we sent a committee out. We adopted the report, the committee report. And after the meeting was over, I sent a copy to our congressional delegation, and that was introduced into the Senate, the first bill, Senate Bill 2020.
Well, Ralph Perdue was a couple of years ahead of me in high school, and then he had this concept of forming an organization, the FNA. And so I worked with him, and there was a few of us that, worked together to get it organized.
Paul Dean and Bill Carlo were instrumental, along with Mary Jane Fate, Ralph Perdue, in organizing FNA, the Fairbanks Native Association, in I believe 1960, very early on. And critical to the development, again, of how the interior would become organized.
Ralph was our president, and then after a couple of years, then I was elected president. So that's just about when land claims was coming about.
Well, I was working for Burgess Construction, and people kept asking me questions about what was going on with the land claims, and I had no idea except what I read in the newspaper. I ran into Ralph Perdue. He suggested I come to one of the FNA meetings, and you know, because they talk about it there sometimes. I went to one of their meetings, and it was kind of interesting, so I continued to go to their meetings and got involved in some of their committees, and eventually became president of Fairbanks Association. I believe I was president for 3 years there. I got involved there heavily in the land claims movement and began going to the AFN board meetings and whatnot. And because of being able to sit on the board, we were starting to go back to Washington, D.C. as a full board, and AFN to lobby for the land claims. The talk was that, you know, why should we have to go back to the BIA and get their permission before we could do anything? You know, we're getting to be big boys now, big boys and girls, and you know, we're able to make our own decisions.
If we waited for the BIA to write a bill, we would be responding to their bill. As a result, we got the initiative, and they were responding to our bill. And we had in it 40 million acres, and so they had to start dealing with that. There were 8 bills eventually before it was all over. President Nixon had a bunch of young people in his office. Laura Burke, Don Wright, maybe Ketzler, and a few others got to these young people and convinced them that 40 million acres was a just settlement. And they took it to Nixon. Nixon agreed.
I started in 1976. I was involved with the Fairbanks Native Association at the time, Tanana Chiefs Conference at the time, and I saw a great need in our villages and our communities throughout Alaska, but especially in the interior where Doyon is situated.
I got started about when I was 25 years old, started attending AFN meetings, and started attending the Tanana Chiefs meetings. We had a leader at that time was pretty smart, and that was John Sackett. He really helped us out. He went to the University of Alaska, and a lot of us didn't get involved in corporate things. It's all new to us. Johnny Sackett kept us involved and focused on what the land claims was.
The origin of the corporations and how it caught support is kind of vague. We looked at the reservation system. After 200 years, any way you cut the data on Indian people, we were at the bottom of the list. So we looked at that and said, we don't want the government managing our business, and failing. If we fail, we'll do it on our own. We want to do our own. So there was strong support to run our own businesses.
That relates back to 1915 with the Tanana Chiefs. Chief said, we don't want reservations. We heard about what the reservations do down the lower 48, and it's not working.
Whoever framed the Native Land Claims Act in Alaska, I believe had the right idea to get away from what I saw in the Southwest of America with the tribes out there, where in Alaska, with our 44 million acres of land and with the regional corporation and the village corporation set up, I believe we have a better opportunity to grow and develop, and certainly the way we want to.
When you think about the Claims Act, it's primarily the regional corporations were the identified large block of land. But then the decision in the talk was, well, what about each village? You know, it just can't be you have all these villages, but you have all these villages in a region. These are primarily the Athabaskan Dina people in this area, but all over there's these villages, and they have their use and claims on that in their areas around their villages. As a result, I think a discussion of what should we do with each village, I think was, well, have village corporations included or part of the claims.
We hit a window of time where 10 years earlier, we might have got more land, or it would have been easier because there was no demand for land. When oil was discovered, land became harder to get. We had to fight harder for it, but money was easier. We hit a period of time where we maximized land and money. It sounds like a lot of money, $962.5 million, but it's really not a lot was not a big cash settlement. Should have really gotten more for that. Our main focus was always land. Without land, Native people will disappear. We're land people.
When I came back from the service in 1971, the land claims was just about culminating in passage. And Emil, Notti, Willie Hensley, Borbridge, and other leaders had been working very hard since 65, 66 to get the Land Claims Act passed.
After the land claims in 71, during a January meeting, I was elected as president of Tanana Chiefs, and then in March, John Sackett. And so as president of Tanana Chiefs, we were basically working out of FNA offices. FNA basically was doing Doyon work.
I think we made a good decision there that when we incorporated Doyon Limited, we'd use Tanana Chiefs board members as the interim board of directors so we can gradually move it in until we learn how to send proxies out, who were the enrollees, how we're going to hold the elections, what terms we're going to have.
Being involved in business all my life, I wanted to work on that aspect as opposed to the nonprofit with Tanana Chiefs. People that were interested in that, in the profit field, got together, and the people that were interested in nonprofit, they kind of self-separated because of what their directions and their drive was. And so we filed the articles of incorporation papers.
They were fairly standard articles and bylaws. There were some things in there that we had to put in there because of it's so stated in the Land Claims Act. I had put in there that to make sure that we had representation from the rural areas, that we get that percentage in there. I've had a few words said to me about that since. I thought because of being headquartered in Fairbanks, that the local people would end up running the corporation and pretty much, possibly forget about some of our needs out in the rural areas. After I became president of Doyon, the main thing was the enrollment contract. All the representatives from the different regions went down to Anchorage to negotiate with the commissioner of BIA, who was Morris Thompson at that time. So we took turns, we drew our numbers out of the hat, and I believe I drew number 6. And Hank Eaton from Kodiak had drew number 1, and he didn't want to go first. So he stood up, waved his number 1 ticket, says, "Who wants to trade?" And I traded. And so we were the first to sign an enrollment contract. And near the end of the day, the BIA called me back in and wanted to renegotiate the contract because they said they gave us too much money. And I told them, no, we weren't. Since the contract was signed, I told them we weren't interested in renegotiating.
I don't think we left very many people out because the word was out, that we're trying to do this corporation thing, and it's going to relate to your villages too, because we'll have to incorporate in our villages.
There was a discussion as to how we were going to divide the land, all 12 regions. And the Tlingit and Haida wanted to do it on a population basis. It finally was determined that it would be on a land loss formula.
depending on how much land you claimed in relation to percentage of the amount of land in the state. And a lot of people like to take credit for coming up with the land loss formula. But that was Al Kitzler that brought that up.
At a board meeting, I got up to a plastic overlay on a map, and I drew the boundaries of the regions. And if you look at them on a north slope, I drew the line along the mountaintops, and everything north of the mountains was Arctic slope. Then I got to the drainage of the Koyukuk River between the Arctic slope and the Koyukuk River. That drainage was Nana. The Yukon and Koyukuk River drainage was Doyon. And the drainages and the boundaries, natural boundaries, just happened to coincide with people who had similar languages and lifestyle and dress, and so it worked out.
The ones I really remember, we were looking at the boundaries, and that was kind of interesting because one of the ones that really struck my mind is we were dealing with Nana. And at the time, really Hensley come walking in there and just really confidently shook hands with everybody, went to Lucy Carter, gave her a big hug and everything else. And it was just, you know, like Jimmy Huntington and the elders leading the way. And they gave a presentation on their people's land use and ours that overlapped. So we had to compromise and negotiate a boundary line. And that went really smoothly. I think you know, people respected each other. And
well, we had land management with Doyon at that time, and I remember Richard Frank was on that, working on lands, and we had other people working on it, but we looked at resource development, number one. And we learned that from the old people. Where is the mining places around here, you know? And we didn't know about oil at that time. We heard about it, but you know, where would be potential for oil and mineral rights? And where do we need to select land where there was traditional use of the land for fish camps, for spring camps and stuff like that? I think we learned from the old people that our resource was, we had plenty, and that was for the long-term use. And it's not gonna happen tomorrow or next year. There was potential there, and we learned from the old people, and we selected land accordingly.
Villages would say, okay, you know, and we use this a lot for trapping here, hunting here. It was with their input. Of course, Tanana Chiefs did a lot of this early on and establishing where our boundaries was.
The village corporation, the regional corporation had this checkerboard pattern. And I don't remember ever Doyon saying, no, you can't select that because we've selected it. I think Doyon said, you select what you want out there in the villages, and then the state and Doyon, then we're going to touch and have contiguous lands to you. But it was never Doyon barging in and taking the first bite at the apple.
what was so an eye-opener to me is, you know, I was on a trap line during those days too. And so you had to go up there and take off your big parka and everything else and change into city clothes and go into a building, and it was just totally different. Coming, you know, the day before coming off the trap line, there's snowshoes and everything else, and then going to board meeting and sitting there with the folding chairs and around there and trying to look at the visioning for the corporation. The other thing, you know, we barely had $1,000 in our bank account, and we're dealing with the Doyon billing for like $1 million with the land and everything else. It was just mind-boggling for me. I couldn't even write $1 million in my checkbook.
Wasn't trying times, it's just that it was just all through that, just learning process all the time, you know. We had to learn about corporations. We had to learn about how to deal with money. And what are we going to do about land?
You know, there were short-term goals. As I mentioned, enrollment, getting offices. Okay, now that I'm the president, what do I do? Developing org charts, job descriptions, you know. And then, okay, now where are we going to get the money to continue this? You know,
I understand we got some land claims money coming.
We knew we had to have a vision. You know, it's like land selections, you know. Which lands are we going to select? If we get money, what we're going to use it for? You know, we had to talk about that and see what would be the most advantage to Doyon Limited.
What do we invest in? You know, when you're a brand new company and you want to have a lot of land, you know, what should we do with the land?
Everything was happening at just a fast clip. And the whole idea of going through change in Doyon, everything happened so fast, and it was like trial and error, a lot of making mistakes. And
Here we are, a bunch of trappers and construction guys, not a lot of college, frankly, or a lot of business corporate experience, certainly no lawyers or CPAs in the room. So what do you do? Oh, here's $10 million, or what are you going to do? It was not an easy job at all to figure out how are we going to grow. And I think we got invested. One of the first things was in the hotel in Hawaii, for God's sake. How in the world did that happen? But the fact of the matter is we looked at the numbers. We knew enough to look at numbers on, oh, gee, it looks pretty good. Gee, we like to go to Hawaii. Oh, so let's buy the hotel. I think we did a little more investigation than that. That was a lesson for us to say, well, yeah, but what good, how many Athabascans are working at the Maui Lu? So we got into the construction business early on. We should have known better that construction is a hard business to succeed at. We took a couple wrong turns and things didn't go our way, so we didn't do quite so well in the construction business and withdrew our forces and looked another way. Early on, late 70s, early 80s, we had guys going up the North Slope too, working on the rigs and working pipeline, and so we looked hard at that. And so I think with the likes of probably Ori Williams, Tim Wallis, Neil Scannell, especially these characters, we started to look at what could we do in the oil patch. And lo and behold, we said, let's think about this drilling business. What the heck, drilling business? But we had enough sense to team up with a very aggressive but sharp businessman whose father had a drilling company. And there born the Doyon Drilling.
He was talking about building a new drilling rig where it could be mobile. The camp would be mobile. The camp would be part of the drill rig. It really intrigued me. And he said, then you get these big 747 wheels to do that. And he says, you put them on the rig. And he says, they'll each have their own power unit. And you just put that down, and these wheels will come down, things will lift up, and we can move it. It sounds like it'll work, and there are risks there of hitting a bump and tipping over. I said, but if it works, we'll modernize the drilling industry, and we'll probably own the slope. So, formed Doyon Drilling Company, and obviously, Doyon Drilling's been doing very well. Has an excellent reputation, and the companies obviously think a lot of us. I believe Doyon Drilling owns every record on the slope. While that was going on, I called Morris Thompson in to the office and told him that, we were getting in the drilling business and we need to set up a school and first find out what all the positions were on a drill rig. And let's set up a school so when this drill rig is ready, we can have some shareholders ready to go to work on the drill rig. And which he did, and it turned out very well. He did the Seward Skill Center, and they set up this curriculum that fit our needs exactly. And so I think that was one of the projects that really went according to plan.
I think that was the biggest success story Doyon ever had, is setting up Doyon Drilling. We got into the market, and through that we learned and learned and learned. And that's a major success that the Native people in Doyon region and our leaders got into. And I think that was good for the environment, you know, and it was good for Doyon. Interesting time too, you know, because we're getting into big times now. And we just hoped it'd work, and it did. And there's still a lot of things, I guess, I wouldn't know out there that's available, and I know that Doyon is very careful of what it gets into.
To start with, they could have good qualified joint venture mining companies, but do like they did with the oil up there. They finally peeled it off and run it themselves now, and do the same thing with mining. There's so much mineral development in the state that is waiting to be developed, and so many jobs involved. And with the modern technology, all these people that say, oh, you're gonna harm the environment, do this, do that, they're thinking of mines back in the 1800s and 1910s and 20s where they did abuse the whole world through their mining process. But now it's so controlled environmentally, failure is almost irrelevant. You always prepare for it, but it's almost irrelevant that it would ever happen. And so we should spend more time encouraging mining and less time criticizing it.
Well, we knew there was possibilities that we could become a big company. Again, that starting out was pretty hard, you know, because I think we're still in the learning transition period after 49 years.
It was all new to many, many of us. And so if it was new to us and we were being really educated as we formed those first years, then what would you think out there in the villages? What we heard in the villages, loud and clear, and today it's still very loud and clear. Our land is our most important asset. Don't give away, don't sell our lands for our subsistence needs. And that still remains today. We haven't given, sold any acreage of land, of Doyon land. And I'm very proud of that we have to retain our land base for our villages to survive, to thrive, and that's who we are. As our shareholders were getting older, we didn't have younger shareholders because they weren't enrolled under our land claims.
If you're not involved in a way that ties you to our corporation, and the best way is to be part of Doyon, be part of the village corporation, and the only way to do that was to open the rolls. There were some arguments about that in the beginning, but I think ultimately it pretty much was a unanimous vote to go ahead and do that. And I'm proud to say Doyon was one of the leaders to do that.
If you're part of it, you'll have more of a stake in it, rather than waiting till you're willed all the shares, like, you know, or gifted the shares. So to me, that was really important to also, if you know, people open it up, then you're also responsible for educating the new children, the next generation, and the land tenure system. And as you go along that 100-year roadmap, you know, it includes the livelihood of people whose parents would die or grandparents would die, and they'd receive the shares. If they have no experience with the land and don't know what the land is like or what it's worth like, as far as hunting and fishing or in the stories of their grandparents and great-grandparents, and even today in the next 10, 15 years, it'll be even more so, because our children and grandchildren will have pockets of stocks from the regions and without any any type of ownership or knowledge of the land.
It's so great to see Tanana chiefs and Doyon support things like language institutes and dances and culture to tie more and more to where we started, because as hunters and gatherers way back when.
I'm like Grandpa Peter John and old Andrew Isaac, education, education, education. I look at the Doyon slate, you know, and this guy's got bachelor's degrees and accounting degrees and stuff, and I think at that time that's what we wanted, and I see it happening with our corporation, Doyon.
So many of our people are going through like the Doyon Foundation, getting scholarships and going off to college and getting degrees. We have the first doctor in our family and professor up in university. So it's really good to see that. I'm really proud to have been part of that, you know.
You know, when you go to school to become in the business field, you know, whether you start up your own business or whether you decide someday, you know, you'd like to come back and use some of your talents at Doyon, don't forget, we have a culture that goes way, way, way back. We need to preserve that and keep that, you know, in your mind when you make a decision. And I think as we grow, you know, we're going to have different companies evolved. And so the opportunities there is opportunities for you and also your children. So, you know, the young people now, you know, need to start thinking about their children. So you look back and think of the choices one makes. And just a yes or a no can make a big difference, you know. And maybe somebody ought to mention that to some of the younger kids. Choices are important.